Welcome to Joey's Social Club. I'm Joey Seifert. And welcome to the show. I'd like to introduce Kerrie Droban, award-winning true crime author. Kerrie, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. You're out in the amazing warm weather, aren't you? Out west?
Yes, I'm in an odd state. I always call Arizona the odd state, but yes, it's a beautiful weather on a different time zone from everybody else in the population and different in many respects. But
It does have a wide range of weather pattern from the north of the state all the way south. Like you think of Arizona, everybody thinks like, well, it's 700 degrees and it's a desert, but it's really not. There's some gorgeous areas in Arizona.
right, yeah, it's a living desert, and so you can go a couple of hours outside of Phoenix and be in Flagstaff, which is very woodsy and feel like you're in a different state completely. So it's really interesting, but most of it is really, it has a Wild West feel. It really does feel like it's pretty much reminiscent of the old cowboy days.
Yeah. So I do have some friends out there that ride, and a lot of them, they'll start out and they'll be riding throughout the day and it'll be 100+ degrees and they'll have, just their vest on and no shirt and they're flying, and it'll get into the night times and it'll drop into like the 30s in some of the areas.
Yeah, yeah, it's important to have layers.
Absolutely. So I am incredibly excited to get into um, a lot of the books that you've written, but I guess I want to ask you, how did you start writing about, of all things, outlaw motorcycle clubs?
I get asked that question a lot because it's not really a normal path for me.
Yeah.
I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I had just gone out as a criminal lawyer. I had kind of hung out my own shingle and started working in death row cases of all things. So I was doing capital litigation when I first got approached. And by the way, I was also a fiction writer. So I was a novelist before I became
Okay.
a writer. And I was working on my third novel, and I could not find a publisher for it at all. I wrote suspense thrillers. And so anyway, I was working as a capital lawyer writing suspense thrillers, and I got approached by Jay Dobbins, who was, of course, Jay Bird in
Jaybird.
Operation Black Biscuit. And he was still working for the ATF at the time. And he contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in writing his story. And so, my first response to that was no.
No.
No, nothing about the Hells Angels. I know nothing about, I mean, I had prosecuted, I was a prosecutor before I was a defense attorney. So I had prosecuted gangs, but not biker gangs. I knew nothing about it.
Okay.
I barely knew what a motorcycle was. So that's my experience in this wheelhouse. So, but he approached me because I was an attorney, and it's a crime to sell your story while you're still working for a government agency. So,
Mhm.
so his proposal was really kind of outrageous for a writer. But so he approached me and said, would you be interested in doing this? I said no. And then he came back a second time, and I said no again. And then by the third time, I thought, well, what the hell, like maybe this is my lucky break. But the catch to it was I couldn't have anything in writing with him. I couldn't have a contract, or I couldn't, I didn't even have an agent at the time. I
Mhm.
had no agent, no publisher, I had nobody lined up. And, so this was really quite a tall order for me. And so when he approached me to do this, I told him, I said, I don't have any experience in this. I don't have an agent. So you're just gonna have to go along with, for the ride with me on this. And he was fine with that. And so the way that I got my agent was also very unconventional. I wound up doing some research on Levine's agent, And he wrote he was the DEA agent who went undercover. And so I wound up and found his agent, contacted his agent over lunch hour, because that's how attorneys accomplish a lot of business. You know, we call each other at lunch. So I did not do this in any orthodox way. Called up this agent and said, I have a story for you. Would you be interested in it? And it was literally in a 5-minute conversation. And he said, I think I can sell your story. So that's how I got the agent. And then everything from there was kind of history. But it was a very interesting odyssey, I will say, because it was a little bit like, writing undercover. So I was writing undercover an undercover story. And for those in your audience that don't know the story, it's the story of Operation Black Biscuit, which was memorialized in my book, Running with the Devil. And Jay Dobbins also has a book out called No Angel, which takes a different perspective. But Running with the Devil was really it was written as an ensemble, because that's how I saw the case. As this was a group of it was a mix of ATF operatives and informants and cops, basically, that went in and did improvisation, and they were the first ever infiltration by law enforcement, infiltration into the Hells Angels in so
it was a massive case.
Massive case, fascinating case, and very ironic on so many levels, because not only was I writing it undercover, the operatives were undercover, and the story or the investigation, the infiltration was undercover. So they were impersonating, these operatives were impersonating a fake outlaw biker gang in order to infiltrate the Hells Angels. So everything was a story within a story. And it was fascinating all the way around to write it and eventually get it out. And I should mention that halfway through writing of this book, they all kind of like disappeared on me. So when the book actually came out and was published, I was sort of flying in the wind alone out there, and really, really worried, because there were like 16 pending indictments.
Yeah, it was big.
It was really big.
Yeah.
And I really thought my whole career as a lawyer was over, like in a heartbeat. That's how high the stakes were for everybody involved. I thought, I'm going to be the first lawyer in history to completely, mess up an enormous criminal investigation. And I was very worried about that. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And all of the indictments were dismissed. And they were dismissed on the day that the book came out, which is another crazy coincidence. But so lots of very strange things happened with that. And now the book is actually, I have heard through the grapevine through some of my clients that it is required reading for prospects into the Hells Angels.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like what not to do.
I found that I found both books. I've read both books, and I found it interesting that he was able to do as much as he was able to do with the group of people that he was able to do it with. But I also found it very interesting, and I've seen it in a lot of other cases, the extent that the government will go to try to get convictions of these motorcycle clubs. Not just motorcycle clubs, but of outfit in motorcycle clubs and so on. The sheer amount of money that is put behind these clubs. I mean, this was not, this was a massive case, as you know, and this was not like, a $5,000, $10,000. I mean, you're talking millions and millions of dollars. And then for them to walk, I mean.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was an 18-month investigation, and many of them have lasted at least that long. And it's very, very difficult for the government to keep track of what's going on in these investigations too. And that was a large part of the problem in Operation Black Biscuit. I mean, it was completely novel. It was improvisation. they were kind of making things up as they were going along because they really had no idea how far they were going to get. I mean,
Right.
they didn't think they were going to become patched members. I mean, that was like completely out of the wheelhouse. And the other problem with that, I mean, Operation Black Biscuit was really interesting on so many levels because it was the first time they ever sent a female agent in.
True.
And you
And that's
know,
a very dangerous world for a female.
very, very dangerous, but
Hmm.
also very fascinating from, just from an investigation perspective, because they could get so much intel from just the female population who had their own hierarchy and their own set of rules and constructs within that whole organization, which was really fascinating. But it was so dangerous for the operatives themselves to do this infiltration because they really didn't know what they were doing. I mean, because it was improvisation, one door sort of opened and led them into another arena. And I think what happened from the ATF's perspective was they were relying on intel from really Jay and Beef, the other
Hmm.
case agent involved, and and not really knowing what they were going to get at the end of the day. And because Jay's, and you're right, I mean, the extent and the length to which he went to get his information was really extraordinary. And all of the tests that he was given by the Hells Angels, the drug test to make sure he wasn't an undercover operative. I mean, the one thing that he could not fake was women, women being thrown at him. I
Hmm.
mean, how can you fake that? I mean, Jay had a family, he had, there were certain lines he couldn't cross, even as an undercover, but he had a persona that he had to maintain. And so it was really this interesting juggling act. And so, that's when they decided that they were going to bring in a female undercover agent. And they needed somebody that was really going to fit the bill. And they had a few missteps in the beginning, women that were just not able to converse as easily or be in that persona that they had to be. And so when they found Jenna, she was amazing. She was a newbie right out of the academy, right out of training,
Yeah.
and just sort of was able to blend into that whole milieu and get the women to trust her. And so she was a whole nother level of intel. And I really think that if they hadn't brought her in, they would not have gotten as far as they did. But it created a lot of problems that were unexpected for the ATF because now they had to worry about her safety
Right.
and who was going to protect her. While they're worrying about what's going on with Jay and his infiltrations. And so this was like a massive undertaking. And you're right. I mean, it's like it kind of grew its own legs and took off. And then when the kind of the finale or the climax, when the ATF orchestrated this fake murder of a rival gang, a Mongol, out in I mean,
Out in the desert.
crazy. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. They faked this whole murder. They had a CI, pretend they had to extricate their informant out of this group. He was losing it. He
Right.
was getting like PTSD and flashbacks and all kinds of issues. And
He was also back on drugs, correct?
yes, he was back
Yeah.
on drugs, and he
Yeah.
was needed to get out of the operation because he was compromising everything. So
Right.
the operatives needed a way to extricate him in a way that made sense to the Hells Angels. You can't just pluck somebody out of an
Right.
operation. It's like, oh, sorry, he had to go back to his ordinary life. So they created this crazy improvisational murder. I mean, it was really, it's never been done before, and I don't know that it ever will be again. But Jay came up with this idea to have this wandering Mongol in Magdalena, Mexico, that
Right.
gets murdered. And so, they murdered him, and they faked the whole thing. They got cow's blood.
They made it look really good.
Made it look good. They made
Yeah.
it, I mean, they had to take photographs. They had to have a body of evidence, so to speak,
Right.
to bring back. And so all of this was like massively orchestrated and terrifying, I think, for the operatives and also for the ATF, because they didn't know if it was going to go south. They had no idea that this was going to be accepted. And and the thing that happened, the result of that was even more extraordinary because they committed this fake murder. They were now, revered in the Hells
Right.
Angels, and they wanted them to become full patch members. And of course, at that time, what happens and what has happened in a lot of these investigations is you have what is called going native, where somebody is so involved and ingrained in the investigation, they almost start to believe their persona. They almost become the person that they're.
Mhm.
And I think Jay would concede with that too. I think he writes about that, how
Yeah.
much you become so involved in it that you can't see the way out. And so,
There's
so
a real fine line there where it's real easy to lose yourself.
yes, very easy. And I think
Mhm.
it's very, very common with undercovers, because they have to, in order to survive, they have to be that person. And they have to be that person 24/7. And that's the really extraordinary thing about not only Jay, but other operatives that I've written about, that you have to become that role 24/7. So regardless of whether you have a family and other obligations, I mean, life continues
Right.
outside of that
And his
whole.
life and his outside life did suffer. His family life suffered. And even after everything, his life did not just go back to normal. His life was kind of destroyed with what he did.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot. I think and that's why it's ironic, but a lot of them will go back undercover for that reason. You would think that after surviving an extraordinary experience like this, and being extricated out and being back in quote unquote real life. I mean, there were many of them that decided not to go back undercover, not to to do those roles again. But for many of them, it's a way of life, and it becomes the only life that they understand, and the
Like a
only.
soldier coming back from war.
Yes,
They just
yeah,
they need to go back to war to feel normal again.
yeah, and it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I call it the ripple effect, because it's not, they cannot find their footing in,
Mhm.
in the outside world, and I think it's yeah, I think it's a very real thing, and so they'll go back in and they'll become another persona, or they'll look for that, and there's certainly no um, shortage of roles like that where people need to go in and get intel, but it
Right.
definitely, they put themselves at such high risk that that's the only way that they can survive.
So
And
now you talk about, so we'll go from Running with the Devil, which was again, it was a great book. But I want to jump to, you talk about people that lose their footing and try to get their footing. They need to go back and do it again. If we can go into your Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, because
yes,
that's just a typical, I don't want to say typical, but that's just a story similar to, you go from one place and you need to go back and do it again, and you need to go back and do it again, and you just stay in this repetitive cycle
right,
as an
yes,
undercover.
yes, as an undercover, and that was Charles Falco's story, and he was another really extraordinary person who he was sort of like the opposite of Breaking Bad. He was the bad who then became good. And
Yeah.
so it became like this almost heroic fashion. And I think now he actually has a following that he's very revered for who he is and what he's accomplished. But
Mhm.
he was um, he was basically trying to cut down his time, as he was up for charges, he was facing 20 years in prison, and he was basically asked to go in and infiltrate.
And he
Um,
was originally doing that for manufacturing, or he was
he
he
was
was a drug dealer, right?
drug dealer, yes. And
Yeah.
in fact, his prequel story is also really fascinating. He worked for a big drug kingpin in LA for the Bulgarian mob.
Okay.
And so that's a really interesting story in and of itself, which I also tried to write and get published out there. But anyway, that's the whole backstory of him. So he comes from that world, and he's working off all of these charges, and he winds up infiltrating the Vagos, which have never been infiltrated. But his infiltration takes a really interesting and dangerous turn, because he witnesses a gangland murder.
Mhm.
And now he becomes the key witness to that murder and winds up testifying against them. And so his story is extraordinary, because he literally is facing it from all different angles. He winds up in prison, because he has to be captured with all of them, even though he's working for the government. He has to make it look real. So he winds up in prison and segregated. And in order to keep himself safe, he winds up in solitary confinement for a month at least, I think a little bit longer. where, he's almost losing his mind in solitary, but he can't go back in regular population because he needs to be protected, because now he's got gangs in prison after him.
Right.
So he's, so he's like a chameleon of sorts, where he's really trying to, survive by becoming all of these different personas. And so, after he infiltrates the Vagos, then he goes and he infiltrates the Mongols, and then his final scene, or his final, I guess, climax, is he goes and he tries to infiltrate the Outlaws.
Mhm.
But, then he's working for and with the ATF and winds up infiltrating the Outlaws. So he infiltrates 3 gangs, and when he comes out of it, and he actually has a lot of like personal things happen to him while he's doing these infiltrations. One of which is he breaks his neck, which is crazy. He breaks it
He
on
had a
the-
motorcycle wreck,
Yes, on a motorcycle.
slammed into a guardrail, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Slammed into a guardrail on his way to the Outlaws' big meeting. Okay. So that is a classic story of how, they cannot extricate him to go to the hospital because he's with the ATF. And in fact, the ATF are riding so fast, he has to keep up with them. And that's how he has this accident. So
Yeah.
he can't give them away. He can't be escorted off by an ambulance. He has to like just suffer through this. He goes to this big meeting with a broken neck, where he's literally, the ATF agents will prop him up against the wall so he can make it through this meeting. And now he's got to be in and out of the hospital on morphine in all of these meetings, and pretend like he's normal, and
Yeah.
go on these runs and do all of these things while he's literally broken. He's like physically broken. So it's quite an extraordinary story of how the lengths to which he will go to get
Yeah.
into an information, and and the sort of the casualties and the fallout from that.
But now he was able to walk away and go back to a quote unquote normal life.
He was for a period of time. I mean, he winds up in witness protection for a while. And that's interesting too, because he talks about how even that is not a safe haven for him. It's not a place that he feels
Right.
like he can really survive. And I've heard this a lot from people that are in witness protection. It's
A
almost
lot of people leave.
a lot of people leave. It's
Yeah.
another form of prison,
Yeah.
which is interesting. It's just a different version of it. It's almost, he describes it almost like solitary confinement, because you're really isolated from everybody. You cannot be, I mean, it's a different role. It's almost like a non-role. On the one hand, he's trying to impersonate and be these other people. And then in witness protection, he's a non-person.
Right.
Persona non grata, basically.
He's
And
supposed to blend in.
yeah,
Yeah.
blending it, and it didn't suit him at all. And so he actually, he comes out of it to work on, the Mongols, to infiltrate again, and to risk his life in order to feel normal, in order to feel like he can function. So it is a really interesting, I guess it's almost like an investigation into what it's like to be undercover, to be in witness protection, to be in solitary confinement, to be all of these things that most people will never experience, and to see it firsthand from an informant who then elects to go back into it and do it all over again.
Did you
And-
just find your next book? I mean, it would be an incredibly interesting study, because obviously it's filled with, post-traumatic stress, but then it's filled with everything that everybody just wants to hear about, all these different worlds, and these officers that go in and they somehow, fudge those lines, and they don't always come out so well.
Yeah, there really is a lot of fallout from that. It's very interesting. And what I find really interesting is that a lot of them, I mean, Charles included, tried to have a quote unquote normal life. Like they would do the conventional thing, which is marry, right? Marry and have a child, and have that sort of compartmentalization of one world, and be able to step into this other world on multiple levels. So it is very interesting in that regard. And I think what makes it even more interesting is just on a personal level, the reason I was able to really understand that world on so many levels is I once upon a time, no longer, once upon a time was married to an undercover.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I really was able to understand what it's like to compartmentalize your life.
Yeah, you had a different perspective than most people have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was fascinating for me to be able, I mean, I think it actually, in a lot of ways, it makes perfect sense that I've been asked to write these stories, even though the people that have approached me to write them had no idea that that was my background.
Yeah.
But it really gave me an interesting perspective because I understood it from so many levels. I understood it from the spouses who couldn't understand where their husband went. And I understood it from the husband's perspective, having to keep secrets and not being able to tell what was going on for the
Sure.
safety and protection of what was happening on the outside world. So it was very interesting, all of those different levels of areas. And even as a criminal defense attorney, understanding that perspective, like what happens to people that are exposed to severe trauma and
Mhm.
things that, like, how do they continue to function and how do they let their guard down enough to even get help for
Usually not. Usually you don't function very well.
no,
And
you
usually you go through your entire life and you never let your guard down.
right. You're very hyper vigilant. I
Yeah.
mean, you wind up, I mean, just your whole life is affected. I mean, I've heard this from the operatives and from some other people, you know, like even something as simple as going to eat at a restaurant, like,
Mhm.
you know, going to eat at a restaurant and making sure that you sit with your back to the wall so you can face the front door.
I've heard that before.
You know that somebody's not gonna walk in, or you know,
Yeah.
or you don't ever let somebody you don't know sit down at the table with you, you know.
Right. You're always paying attention. Yeah, you're always hyper vigilant, no matter what. And other people that haven't suffered a trauma in any way don't always understand that. They're like, I don't understand. Why do you do this? Why do you always have to sit in the corner? Why can you tell me what every single person in the restaurant ate? Stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, you have to be really pay a lot of attention to detail and
Yeah. So
facial
how
expression.
did you go from, so you went, I know we're kind of jumping, but then I don't personally know that much about the pagans, but you went into prodigal father, sorry, pagan son.
So that was interesting. So when Running with the Devil came out, I I vowed to myself it was probably the most stressful experience that I've ever gone through.
Yeah.
Probably aged about 10 years, and I told myself, there's no way I'm ever doing this again. It's never happening again. This is like a one-time thing, doing this book. And my husband at the time said, yeah, don't be surprised if you get a rival gang that wants you to write their story.
Right. Exactly. I want attention too.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, LT is the subject of Prodigal Father, Pagan Son, contacted me. He had read Running with the Devil, and he said, you know, I have a story to tell you. And so each one of my books takes a different perspective with a different gang. So it's like the big five done in a different way. And
Mhm.
so LT's story, I was really interested in his story because he was somebody that was born into an organized crime family, and his father was the president and the founding member of the Pagans. So,
Okay.
so it was very interesting writing his story. He was young. He told me that he didn't have a choice, and he was hired, or I guess solicited by his father's nemesis to murder his father. So it was a story of betrayal and growing up in this organized crime family and learning a little bit about pagans. And because he was in Philadelphia, we struggled a little bit with the time difference. So I was writing his book at like 4 a.m. and writing it on sticky notes and sitting in a closet writing because I didn't want to disturb the rest of my family writing it. And P.S. I did not even tell my family that I was writing this book. So this was another book that I was
Another
writing.
undercover book.
So I thought I'm never going to survive this. If I let my family know that I'm doing another book like this, they're just going to extricate me from my family.
From your, yeah.
So, yeah, so it was a 2-year odyssey writing this book. It was fascinating, and we would have conversations over the phone. I mean, we would basically talk almost on a daily basis about his life. And I mean, if you can imagine this, I can't even imagine this. If somebody says to me, tell me about your life, give me your life story. I
Yeah.
mean, the things that like I wouldn't even know where to begin. And so that was part of it, like not only gaining his trust, but having him talk to me about very, gut wrenching incidents. I mean, the story is really, people that read it, it's very tough for them to digest because it's
Mhm.
hard to imagine that somebody has actually lived this life. And yet I think it's a life that many have lived in that world, and so it encapsulates everything that he went through, his struggle with his father's nemesis, his name is Gorilla, and what he did to kind of avoid. He was part of the Pagans for a little bit, and then he was out of the Pagans, and what that all entailed, um, and then I interviewed him, and I finally actually had to fly him out to Arizona to interview him because I thought I need to get the story, I need to meet him, I need to see him and figure out what his
Yeah.
mannerisms are so I can capture that in the book. And that was really interesting too, because he flew out here with a character who's called the Saint in the book, and he's actually the vice president of the Pagans. I don't think he is anymore, but he was such a character that he gave me so much breadth and depth to the story. So it was really fascinating to meet him and interview him. And I never would have met him had I not decided that I needed to fly LT out. And the really extraordinary thing about that book is it became such a hit that it was published in multiple languages, and it was huge in Australia. And so the
They have a
publisher,
huge biker world there
yeah,
in
huge
Australia.
world. And so it was fascinating, the success of that book, because it really changed LT's life. The Australian publisher wanted to meet LT, and they flew him out to Sydney.
Wow.
This is a guy that has never been out of the country, never been to Australia, and she wants to fly him out there for a 10-day press tour in Australia. It was amazing. It was really
Yeah.
fun because, I got to play a little bit of Cyrano de Bergerac, where I was like telling him, this is how you need to talk. This is what you need to say, because it's one of the things we always joke about this. LT said, he goes, you made me look so good. You made me sound so good in the book. And he goes, what if I don't sound the same way?
Yeah.
And
It's funny the things that some of these guys worry about, isn't it?
yeah, it really is. It was really fun to kind of, give them a little bit of like, here's basically, I was just saying, be yourself. This is what they want. They want to see you as yourself, but he got like an all expense paid trip to Sydney, and it was just incredible. And I thought, man, now I've I've never been to Australia, and he gets to go to Australia.
Right. Do you
But
find that, especially with this book, I think how you said, a lot of people might not believe that somebody lived this life, or, most of these guys, I mean, this is just a day-to-day thing. It's not like they wake up and they talk to people. And when you step in and start writing the book and getting the stories out, do you feel that you're the author? Or do you sometimes feel that you're more the shrink at the time? Like, oh my God, I'm so excited. I finally get to talk to somebody about my life and tell everybody all this, screwed up stuff. And I got somebody that is captivated and wants to hear what I have to say.
yeah, there is, I don't know that I've ever really felt like I was the shrink. I think I'm fascinated by people that want to tell me their story. And I find stories fascinating in and of themselves. And I've always loved that medium, and I've always been, a fan of that. So I think what's fascinating to me is being able to capture it. Like I have to get into their heads in order, it's a little bit like method acting, I have to really experience and feel what they're feeling. And some of those experiences, if you can imagine, I mean, I've never witnessed a murder. I've never witnessed half of the things that they've witnessed. But I think just, being able to do it from their point of view and to feel, I think it's a real compliment to me when they say to me, you've really captured it, or that's exactly how I feel. I couldn't have put it into words more. And there are definitely scenes like when they tell me things that it's hard for me to get out of my head. So I have a little bit of that too. Like it's almost like I get secondary PTSD from what
Yeah,
they're
that was actually going to be my next question. Like how, because obviously these guys are telling you stories and they're telling you stories unguarded. How many of those stories do stick with you, and how do you put that away, you know, put that at rest to where it doesn't continue to haunt you, I guess, or bother you.
Well, I mean, I think it is really hard. You know, when I'm writing the book, they usually take about a couple years to write each one. And, you know, and I think a lot of it is because I'm processing it and I'm trying to figure out how best to tell it without, you know, I think the thing is, I don't want them to ever come across as victims. That I want them to come across as inspiring or empowered.
Mhm.
You know, that they've had these experiences, particularly with LT. I mean, he didn't ask for these experiences. They kind of came upon him because of
Forced upon them. Yeah.
yeah, like how he grew up. And so I think for me, it was really important for me to capture his the strength out of it, that resilience out of it. And so so yeah, I've lived with it. I mean, I remember a lot of his stories without, I mean, I haven't looked at the book in years and I haven't you know, thought about it, but I do remember very specific details. You know, like one in particular sticks with me a lot is that, you know, he would have to sleep on the floor. And one of the concerns that he had is that there were cockroaches on the floor.
Mhm.
And cockroaches, they don't go in reverse. And I didn't know this, right? So this is a detail that is like stuck with me for years. They cannot reverse. So the fear that he had was that a cockroach would wind up crawling into his ear and
Yeah.
stay ear and not being able to reverse. And that image just like, oh my God.
Freak you out, right? It's like a horror movie.
Yeah. So every time I see a cockroach, I think about that. You know, that's something that I never ever would have, it would not have been in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Heard that story. So there are many, many stories like that that stick with me. And I think, you know, it's made me much more, I'm very careful of what I do in my private or personal time to kind of offset that, you know. So, you know, I'm not I'm a firm believer in going out into nature, you know,
Yeah.
like kind of get some peace and calm and something to counterbalance all of that ugliness. And you know, it is really interesting though. I mean, I know that, you know, I think about that, like the people that purposefully go into that world, like the informants or the infiltrators, they live in that ugliness and that's familiar to them. And so I have to be really careful that doesn't become my familiar, because when it becomes my familiar, then I'm living in that darkness
Mhm.
too.
So,
And so
so in trying to not be in the familiar, you went and wrote another outlaw book, right?
right. Yes, I am not walking the talk.
So you went on to write The Last Chicago Boss,
Yes,
Big
yeah.
Pete.
So Big Pete. So that was interesting too, because you know, when I finished the Vagos book, uh, you know, I thought that was going to be the pinnacle of my biker career, basically.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, that one was made into a television show. I was really proud of it, and you know, I thought I've covered 3 biker gangs in that book. You know, but the one group I had not covered was the Outlaws, at
The
least
Outlaws,
directly, right?
one of the biggest clubs in the world.
The biggest clubs and one of
Yeah.
the yeah, and I thought there's no way, you know, there's no way an outlaw is gonna come and, you know, ask me to write their story.
Right.
And so here comes Big Pete, who, you know, really considers himself, and I think a lot of people considered him like the godfather of the Chicago Outlaws. You know, he's like the boss, or was at the time. And so when I got his call, it was funny. It was very similar to the Hell's Angels one. He said, you know, I read Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, and I really liked how you portrayed the North Clubhouse in that book.
Do you find that funny that that's how all these guys preface their conversation with you is, I read your other books.
Yes,
So, I mean, it's kind of like when Sons of Anarchy came out, you know, everybody hated the show, but I will tell you what, I've been in clubhouses when that stupid show was on and everybody's watching and like, that's bullshit. That's bullshit. That's not how it happens. It's like, everybody goes out and reads it, but it's almost like a lot of these guys are like closet readers. Like they don't want to tell anybody else that they read it.
yeah, I am fascinated by that. I really am, because I'm really shocked. First of all, you know, that anybody reads it. You know? But yeah, that Big Pete would have read this. I mean, I didn't even know who he was, which is really funny. Maybe that was helpful for me,
Yeah.
because he wasn't like a fanboy or anything. But you know, so he says to me, he goes, "Well, I really liked how you portrayed that," and he tells me that he was shocked because he didn't realize. So he was there when Charles Falco infiltrated that
Right.
North House, and so he was totally shocked, and I think really probably a little amused that Charles got to him. that he didn't realize it at the time. And so I think he, he said to me, I have a story for you, and I want to tell you my story. And by the way, I'm dying. So, I'm out of the club, and I want to tell you my story, and I'm dying. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, this is a lot like, Tuesdays with Maury, where I'm going to be interviewing a dead guy. And so
Yeah.
my whole thought at the time, at first I said, no, I'm not interested. That was literally my first response. And then he called about a week later, and he said, I really hope that you reconsider. And I thought, God, I pay attention to things like that. Like if things come around the second, third time, I'm thinking, okay, I must be meant to do this. This must be a sign that I'm supposed to do this. So I didn't question. I thought, well, for whatever reason, I guess I'm supposed to write your story. And the really interesting thing about him, and this has actually been true for quite a few of them, is that he didn't want me to record anything because,
Right.
he basically said, I've survived most of my career not being on a recording, not hearing my voice on a recording. And
Right.
so you're not going to be the one person that, records me. So I was like, okay, well, I can respect that. And so we wound up just talking really initially. It turned into 3 hours every Sunday talking to him. And he was an incredible storyteller. Just charismatic, hilarious, so many things that I did not expect out of him. And I could really get the tone and the voice and the character very quickly with him because of who he was. And so his story, I didn't really know at first what his story was going to be about, because he would start talking about one thing and then it would go into another story. And the stories were so funny that his book actually wound up becoming, I think, probably the funnier ones that I've written, if I can even say that, because
Yeah.
there were so many fascinating things about it, because what he did was he showed me the very, very thin line, which I knew was always there, but he really personified it, the very thin line between cops and gangsters, and the outfit and gangsters, and the
It's
whole
an extremely thin line.
very thin line, and the whole
Yes.
symbiotic relationship between all of them.
Hmm.
And I had always sort of like played with that a little bit in some of my other books. I'd always said, there's very little difference, for example, between, I'm gonna get crucified for saying this, between the clubs and scouting, for example, or the clubs and, and Pete would say, the Moose Lodge or the Order of the Moose, and it's true. And I think the constructs are the same, and Pete went to college. Pete was the president of his fraternity, which again is very unusual for this kind of lifestyle. But, and he would say, as the president of his fraternity, there were lots of constructs that he took from that and developed his own, like almost he was working with prototypes. He would work with, he would invent clubs before he became the boss of.
He was fine tuning himself. Sure.
Yeah, he was like testing the water. So he was very much like an inventor. But the constructs of the fraternity are definitely there. And I've always thought this was a big irony with the clubs, is that, they're outlaws, and yet they're very conforming. They're refined to rules and regulations.
There is a god awful amount of rules.
God awful amount.
I mean, we're free, we're outlaws, screw society. And as soon as you step in the club and you put that patch on, oh my God, there's rules and rules and rules on top of rules.
Rules and meetings and committees, hierarchies, and it's fascinating, but it's true for everything. It's true in the prison system, it's true in the fighting system, the fraternity and the cops and that thing. So I found that all so fascinating. And I think with Big Pete, he really, like, that was a big inspiration for his story too, was that this is how he played the game, because it was it really, for him, I think it was a game. It was a game on how he could get everybody to follow him, to, how he could be the boss of Chicago.
Sure.
And the way for him to do that was he chose this vehicle to do that. And so it was really interesting. And the other fascinating point of that was that his wife worked in this conventional corporate arena. She was IT, and and she becomes an old lady and willingly and embraces it. And she completely shatters this myth of like, oh, these are women that are forced into this, or that, just happen to fall. I mean, maybe there are women like that. I'm sure there are.
There are some, but a lot of them, I think you would be incredibly surprised at the lives that they lead. They're like you said, they're IT and executives, and they choose like this is their separate life that they like to live. It's like they're living both, kind of.
Both. And
almost like an undercover.
It is. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I found that so interesting because I think she's very intelligent. Pete adores her. They're still together, but I mean, I would never hear anything but respect and reverence out of his mouth for his wife. And it really, it educated me on a whole different perspective on what happens with, the old ladies and the hierarchy there. And it was just a really interesting insight into this. And, I think that when interviewing his wife, she would say to me, it was the one world where everything was so well defined that she knew who she was there. And she didn't know who she was in the corporate world. Which
she knew who she was. She knew her place. She knew what her purpose was. And
she knew how she could gain their respect, gain their, which was just an interesting and fascinating perspective. I never would have gotten that, had she not been so willing to be interviewed. But yeah, it was a really, I'd say it's a really fun book to write. And it was very informative. I learned a lot about, the relationship between the Outlaws and the outfit. And
very tight relationship.
Very tight relationship, how one needs the other. They basically needed each other. And how cops really needed the Outlaws. Talk about the third shift, the graveyard shift, but that was really just an example of that kind of symbiotic relationship between the two, where they kind of look the other way. And the other interesting thing about that is how much the cops are starting to resemble or wanting to resemble the people that the clubs and the gangs that they're trying to arrest, which I think is just so fascinating.
I love that you bring that topic up. Because that topic has come up in so many circles. I'm still an avid writer, and there's so many circles that it comes up that the police are out here dressing and acting like 1%ers. Yep. They're wearing the cuts or the vests, and they have the patches, and you would not know the difference on a lot of them. And they're coming up and they're trying to, get invited to all the parties and be friends with all of the outlaw motorcycle clubs. And that's just, I think that's just, I feel like that's beyond right. Like they should not be doing that.
It's very weird. It's really weird. The blending of those two is very strange. In fact, I saw a little bit of it here. I mean, I know it goes on way more than what I've really talked about in Arizona, but this whole, even their websites emulate the 1%ers, but the cops, in a lot of respects, do it, I want to say in a weird way, like worse in some ways than the 1%ers. Like,
well, they're able to because they're protected by the badge. Yeah, they can push it further.
They push it beyond the limits. But I agree with you. It's very disconcerting because, I think you have to choose a side. If you're going to be a cop,
yes,
then be the cop. Be the one who's going to enforce and protect and whatever you're going to do, but don't try to also be blended.
Really badass. Yeah.
Because it's confusing. It's confusing for the public. It's confusing for everybody. I think it's even confusing for the clubs. Because they don't know what.
Well, it is, because a lot of times these guys will show up and the clubs will have no idea. Like, that's one thing. I actually had a long conversation with Pete, and we were talking about the state of, a lot of the motorcycle, not just clubs, but the industry in it of itself. And we had talked about, once like Sons of Anarchy came out, I always push it back to Sons of Anarchy, but once Sons of Anarchy came out, it was like you blinked and all of a sudden there's like hundreds of clubs. everybody's wearing patches and there's clubs everywhere. And you can't, I have some friends that are in the 1% world, and they're like, half of the time we don't, there's so many clubs that pop up. We don't even know who the hell half of these guys are. And this is coming from some of the top clubs that control the area.
And that's a huge problem, I would imagine, for that, because,
Yeah.
one of the reasons you had a lot of puppet clubs and support clubs and people that were, you had to be able to identify your terp and identify who was with you and who was against you. And you're right, it's almost it's almost like that syndrome of, if everybody's special, then nobody is, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
if everybody's a club, then how do you differentiate? And it is kind of a weird age, I think, for the 1%ers and for it's that blurring of the thin blue line. And
yeah, but I wholeheartedly agree. Like, pick a side and stay on your side.
yeah,
if you want to be a cop, be a cop. If you're going to be an outlaw, be an outlaw. And you'll meet at some point, but blurring that line, I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, what do you do when it's time for the OK Corral and everybody's on the same side? I mean, there's there's no shootout, because you're all like working together and kumbaya, and it's just a weird. It is a very weird predicament, but
so you were able to, I don't want to say leave because that's not the right way to say it, but you were able to get away from some of the motorcycle club books, and you wrote a couple other ones called the Socialite Scorned and then Aurora.
Yes. Yeah. So I call it, I don't want to call it vanilla crime, but it was I had the 1% of crime that nobody writes about.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. I don't think there are too many other people writing about that. And
then I don't understand why, but.
And then I have the true crime. A Socialite Scorn was a bombing that happened in Tucson, and fascinating case. It was really, I wrote it from the point of view of two sociopaths, because I just really was fascinated by how two people could be entrenched. They were basically joined at the hip because one contracted with the other to murder her husband or ex-husband. And they were, because the ex-wife couldn't pay out her hitman, in one lump sum, were connected for over 10 years over money. And so it was a really interesting case because they basically imprisoned themselves. They couldn't spend the money. They couldn't divorce each other, so to speak. They were tied together over money. And it's a case that has fascinated, I think, a lot of people. It's been profiled on American Greed and other things. It's like the extent. I mean, you talk about what law enforcement is willing to do to infiltrate a club. This is what people are willing to do for money. I mean, it's just fascinating. It's like the lengths to which somebody will go to extract money from somebody. I mean, in a nutshell, the story is the ex-wife of this real estate mogul in Tucson was mad that her ex-husband stopped paying child support. So she contracted with a hitman to murder him so that she would get his life insurance. I mean, it's the oldest story in the book. And yet it creates.
I mean, most people just go to court.
Right? Court,
yeah.
But it became this fascinating study in evil. I mean, it really was a study in evil, the lengths to which people will go. And then Aurora is the Colorado movie theater mass shooter. And basically, I mean, the premise of that book is the psychiatrist who treated him believed he was evil. And he didn't fall into any category, of like, he did this because he was mentally ill or because he was blah, blah, blah. No, he was actually evil. And so that ties into one of my, like, I'm fascinated by this notion of, are people born evil or do they become evil? Are they
yes, that's like an age-old question.
Yeah. And this book attempts to answer that question. I mean, is this somebody who was born evil? And he at the time, and it's really kind of sad to say this happened in 2012, but at the time, he was the only mass shooter in history to have survived his mass shooting. And he deliberately did that so that people would study his mind. And now, of course, there have been so many mass shootings since then,
Mhm.
where the killers have survived. But it's very interesting, that whole thing. And he was also the first, I think maybe only up to this point, person to have received the longest sentence in U.S. history. He received 3,000 years in prison.
3,000 years.
So
Interesting.
yeah,
So where do you see, obviously, are you still writing?
I'm still writing. Yes, I'm.
Do you have any new projects you want to share or not yet?
Well, I'm starting a new project. It's very much in the early stages of it, so I can't say too much about it. But I
Sure.
promise it will be another crime story.
Another true crime story.
Yes, with an interesting twist.
Great. Great. Well, I greatly appreciate you taking the time and coming on the show. I really enjoy everything that I've read from you so far. I really enjoyed it. Now I'm going to jump into these two other books that we talked about. But I wish you just all the best and great luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks. I appreciate it. This has been another episode of Joey's Social Club. Come back next week for more hard-hitting stories from the Chicago underworld.